Welcome to Literary Libations with Librarians. And this time, since Memorial Day is just around the corner, we're going to be considering Memorial Day, that time of the year that's set aside to remember those who have died while in active service in the U.S. military. And one of the important ways that we remember people is through books. Maybe one of the most significant ways to remember things that have happened in history. And so this time we're going to be talking about books set during times of war. As we talk, if you'd like to get your hands on any of these titles, there's several ways to go about doing that. The first and probably the simplest is to call your local branch of the Monroe County Library System and speak to the staff there, and they'll be more than happy to assist you. The next would be to request physical versions of any of the titles through our online catalog, and the address for that is on your screen now. And we also offer 2 different digital platforms through the Monroe County Library System. And so you may occasionally see one of the titles available that way. If you'd like to do that, there are 2 different platforms. The first is Overdrive, and the app for Overdrive is called Libby. And Overdrive offers downloadable ebooks and audiobooks and also magazines. And the second platform is Hoopla, and through Hoopla you can get downloadable ebooks and audiobooks, movies, music, and graphic novels. And the great thing about Hoopla is that there is never a wait for any of the titles that you see through Hoopla. I am Jennifer Graneski, and I am the community librarian at the Dundee Branch Library. And this week our introductory question is, what did you think of history when you were a student? And how has your perspective changed over time? And so I'll be real honest that I was not a history fan when I was a student. I did take AP history when I was in high school, but only because I was that student that really liked getting good grades. And so I took the class, I got the grade, and I feel as an adult looking back, 20 plus years later, I just don't think I ever understood the purpose of history. I never connected with history. I never made that connection that what happened then had a real and lasting effect on what's happening now. And I'm seeing that more and more as I learn more and more. And the other thing is I feel like I never got a good grasp on world history. I know I had a year of it, and but it felt very limited looking back. I feel like there's whole swaths of history that I know nothing about. I don't know African history. I don't know much Asian history. There's just huge sections, and the amazing thing, particularly because I am still not a history buff. I appreciate it and I'm learning more, but I'm not a history buff. I don't naturally pick up historical fiction or historical nonfiction. But what I really appreciate about book clubs is those kind of force me to get out of my reading comfort zone. And I start reading those and my mind is blown almost every time with how little I know and how important it is. So that's how my perspective has changed over time. Also with us this week is Bonnie Jennings, who is a clerk at the Dundee Library with me, yay, but also a retired school librarian with years of her own history, but not too many years, Bonnie, not too many, just the right amount of years that I love to learn from as a librarian. So Bonnie, how has your perspective on history changed over time?
I'm the same as you in high school. I did all right, but I didn't enjoy it, and I pretty much forgot it as soon as I left the class. But I do like historical fiction. And I'll tell you, one of Bill Riley's, I read Killing Lincoln, and that he writes, I don't know if you've read any of his, it puts it like a story. And I remember telling my husband, I didn't know this, I didn't know that. He said, didn't you learn anything in school? No, evidently I did not. But I like historical fiction and some nonfiction.
Mike and I were just having that conversation because my husband happens to really like history, in particular World War II history. And Masterpiece Theater just ran a series called Atlantic Crossing, which is about FDR during World War II. And Mike looks at me and goes, well, he's got to die pretty soon. And I looked at him and I said, no, FDR serves like another term after this. And Mike looks at me and goes, no, he doesn't survive to the end of World War II, hon. So there's me getting my phone, Googling it. I was like, fine, you're right. But yeah, it's amazing. Like things that you're like, no, I think I know this. And then no, I have so much more to learn. Thank you, Bonnie. Also with us this week is Kelly Beister, who's the branch technician at. And what has been your experience of history over time, Kelly?
Mine's pretty much the same. I hated everything to do with school, so I hated all the things in school. But I also did feel a little bit of a pull when I was younger to historical things, like the Crucible we did in my sophomore high school English class, and I really that's when it kind of, started my intrigue for there. But as I've gotten older, I've definitely embraced the history. I try and learn as much as I can, especially like you said with book clubs. I run a historical book club now, and that really pushes me to read historical fiction outside of my box of World War II and World War I, which is what I'm generally interested in. But I find that when I do now read historical fiction, I'm immediately researching everything that I read. And so I am loving that right now. That I have the time to do it and the means to do it in my book club, because before I was just like, yeah, whatever, let's just get through this because I have to. But now I'm really, really interested in it. And like my kids are really interested in it now. We go to the Henry Ford Museum and Greenfield Village, and like they can't get enough of it, which makes my heart really happy. So yeah, now I have a huge appreciation with it. Like you said, Jennifer, like the connection now, how it connects, then from now, and the parallels that you can draw. But yeah, so I like it now. I didn't then.
Thank you, Kelly. Also with us this week is Jessica Otto, our head of collections. And this is the first time Jessica's been with us. And if you're wondering what the head of collections does, she's the person that makes sure that all the materials that we have in all of our branches land there in great condition, cataloged, so we know where to find them. So that's Jessica. And Jessica, how has your perspective on history changed?
Thank you. So I have always been fascinated by history, even when I was a child in school. But the difference is when I was in school, it always was more like, rather than understanding that these were actual events that people went through, it was more the story of it, just the entertainment value, as if somebody was reading me a fictional story. And as I've grown now in adulthood, I recognize more that, wow, these are actual events. These were actually people that went through these things and did these things. And I find so much value in that as an adult, because any time that I find myself facing any sort of challenge in my life, I sit down and I think, somewhere in history, there must have been somebody else who has encountered this, who has been overwhelmed by this. And so then I research and I read and I look back and say, okay, what solutions were found before, and how can I apply those previous solutions to my challenges that I am facing today? So it has always been a fascination to me, and I think it will always be.
Nice. Thank you, Jessica. And finally with us this week is Kristen Brown, a reference librarian at the Bedford branch. And how has your perspective on history changed over time, Kristen?
So like Jessica, I've always been a huge fan of history. I would pick certain historical events and kind of obsess about them. One very giant one was the sinking of the Titanic. And Kelly's laughing really hard right now because I fixated on it. And I was like in second grade. And so I would go through these different wars and do all the research. And even now, being a reference librarian and going to school to further that, history has just always been a part of my life. But what's changed from being in school to now is I realized that the history that we learn is all told through a lens. So when I'm researching something, I try to make sure that I'm researching a topic through many different lenses from many different people, because a lot of what I learned in school was only written by a small group of people. And so when I'm learning things about other cultures or other places, or even, American history, I try to make sure that I'm getting as many voices and as many opinions and situations about that certain event as I can, in order to get a really well-rounded view of what that was. And I feel like that fits in kind of with what Jessica was saying. You get really personal experiences from so many different people, and you feel like you really connect with the people who have lived in the past, and that kind of bridge between these events that are happening today, that are happening to us. People have gone through those before, and to hear those stories and to learn about their experiences is just, it's kind of an honor. I really enjoy it.
Thank you, Krista. Now we're going to move into sharing our books set during times of war. And I'm going to ask Bonnie if she would be willing to share first.
Sure. You have a pick. Do you have an order of what they were, or does it matter?
You go in whatever order you want. I'm getting them up here momentarily.
Alrighty. I'll start with Across 5 Aprils. It's a older story, so the writing is older, but it's still a wonderful story of the Civil War. And the main characters are based around the Creighton family, who have 12 children, and Jethro, the youngest, is told through his eyes. The year he is born, 3 of his siblings had died of polio. And then later, as he's a young child, another sister is killed in a tragic carriage accident. So it's basically his ideas through this whole war that he thinks is going to be really fun, and he might see brass bands, and it won't take very long. And as we all know, it goes across 5 Aprils. And the story, I think, would be so good if a classroom was doing the Civil War American history, because it lists battles chronologically and how they affect this family. It shows some of the struggles that families then, and it told through his eyes. It was really heart-wrenching. You know, we all know about the brother against brother. One of the brothers in the Creighton family decides he can't decide, and they don't own slaves. They're in Southern Illinois, but he can't decide which side is right. So one of them, Jethro's favorite, most intellectual, calming, thoughtful brother, chooses the South, and the other brothers that are old enough choose to fight for the North. The struggles that family goes through because one of their children chose to fight for the Confederacy, neighbors against them, their barn is burned. It's just one tragedy after another, and the whole family, the resiliency of those people was amazing. And so anyway, listing all the battles, it was good that I had a little background so I knew what, happened, and the way people thought about the generals and their ineptness, and the struggles that all those people went through, and then the hunger. And I just think it would have been a really good teaching tool to see a family's perspective on all these battles. And that towards the end, you do learn, maybe I shouldn't give it away, but the big thing that they all worried about was one of their other sons, Tom, was killed in the war. And they're not only the loss of Tom, but worried if Bill, the Southern soldier, was at that battle and possibly would have killed or been a part of killing the brother that fought for the North. And it just, seen through this little boy's eyes, it was heart-wrenching. But there were good parts. The newspaper editor was a mentor to Jethro, because the dad suffers a heart attack. So Jethro's got to do a lot of grown-up things, and he's just a boy. I should also add, besides the tragic accident of the one sister, so they're helping the boy that was going to marry the sister. Now I'm rambling all around because the plot is really twisted with a lot of layers on it. But the sister was killed because a hoodlum in town had shot a gun and got the horses all trampling, and she was killed that way. And his dad, Jethro's dad, quieted, they want to hang this kid, and quieted the whole town, and had some reason that, enough has been lost. We don't need to do more. So that was kind of the theme through the whole book. You know, we're losing so much. Let's try to be kind to each other, the ones that are left. And there was some reference to one of the cousins that was raised by the Creighton family. He's a deserter, and Jethro finds him and writes a letter to Lincoln. And it was right at the time that Lincoln actually did not pardon, but deserters normally would have been shot. And there were so many Northern deserters, there was a camp of them near town, and that was probably happening all over. And Lincoln said, if you go back to your companies, you will be okay. So it was things like that, and they kept comparing Lincoln to other people in the town. You know, let's try, you know, can we just all try to get along, basically. So, you know, we're kind of repeating history over and over through one war after another. But I'd never read it, and it's an old book. I forget how old. It's a Newbery winner. But it even rang true today. It was I could see it used in a classroom. It'd be very good. Whether anyone will use it, I don't know. But I would recommend it. Okay, the other one is Unbroken. And that is a nonfiction, but it's written like a fiction story. She does jump Linda, what was her name? Laura Hillenbrand. She tells it out of order, like a novel might. She jumps from thing to thing. But it is the story of an amazing man, Louis, and I know I'm going to probably mutilate his name, but Louis Zamperini. He was the son of Italian immigrants. He was born in New York, the state of New York, not the city, but the family moved to California when he was young. So he grew up there. He was what people would have called a hoodlum. He was in a lot of trouble, had a lot of energy. I would bet that he is attention deficit and hyperactive, but he had a talent for distance running. It just came about kind of by accident. He had an older brother, Pete, who tried to channel Louis' endless energy, and he ended up being pretty good at the 5,000 meter. Beyond anybody's dreams, he went to the 1936 Olympics. He met Jesse Owens. We did a little prank on him. He met Hitler. So he had, his whole life was one momentous event after another. And he joined, he trained as an Army bombardier. He was the bomber on planes. The B-24 was what they called a flying coffin, and he was in one of those. And he, you know, after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, he decided to sign up, and he flew several missions. The book kind of tells about the camaraderie between him and the other six people on his plane. And, you know, I think that happens a lot in war. These strangers are thrown together, and he had lifelong connections to them. Some of the interesting things in this story were the danger of war is terrible, and he talks a little bit about, you know, bombing some of the islands near Japan and doing it in the dark, so they're flying in the dark because they don't want to be seen coming in. And not really knowing where they are or what they're doing until they see the bombs fall. You know, just the sheer terror of that came through a little bit. But he also talked about, or she did in her book, she interviewed Zamperini more than 75 times. So it's basically his story told through her excellent writing technique. But battles were not the main way our soldiers were killed back then. 1 out of 6 downings was because of battle. The other 5 were from accidents. And he, in one of these accidents, they were out searching for a plane that had gone down in another plane called the Green Hornet that all the soldiers knew no one should be flying this. But they did. They were looking for the plane that went down in the Pacific, and their plane goes down. 3 of the 6 live, and they are on a raft that, the plane would have. They were on that raft for 42 days. At first, planes went over. They thought they would be rescued, and they weren't. So they're adrift, and there's sharks around, and the terror of that is just amazing. And they had been wounded when they crashed. 2 of them had known each other. They were the regular 6. One was a new guy. So they tried to include him, but they didn't trust him, and he didn't trust them, and he ate all their chocolate the first day. So the drama of all of that was, amazing. For 42 days, he lost half of his body weight. So Mac was the guy that they didn't really know. He didn't last the full time. He passed away while they were at sea. So they had to lower him off, just things that were amazing. And then even worse though, when they finally were found, it was by a Japanese ship. And the ship that rescued them, they fed them, they took care of them, but the captain of that Japanese ship basically apologized that he was going to have to send them to camp that was not going to be good. And the first camp was okay. I mean, by our standards now, it would not have been, but they survived it. And he goes from camp to camp. He ends up in 2 or 3, where one of them had a commander that probably was a psychopath, from what they say. And he had it in his mind to destroy Louis from the beginning. And what that man was put through, it was beyond belief, but he chose to, rise above it constantly. They did so many things to try to, trick or undermine the Japanese. So that part was difficult to read through. But Louis, when they finally were released, when the war ended, he went home. He had a girlfriend. They married. But as happens with a lot of soldiers that have gone through that, not the battles as much as the prison camp for him. He had some post-traumatic stress. He had alcohol issues. His wife finally is going to leave him because she comes home one day and he's about to shake their child. And as it happens in this, I didn't expect in the book, he goes to a revival of, now why am I forgetting who is that guy that does all those?
Is it Billy Graham?
Billy Graham, yes. In 1948, he goes to a revival with his wife, and it's like, he had a reawakening. It's incredible. He quit drinking. He became friends with Billy Graham. He went back to Japan in 1950, which to do that then was incredible for anyone in the Pacific to want to go back there, and he did. He met. They put him before 850 war crime Japanese people, and he found many of his tormentors. Actually was happy to meet them, forgave them. The whole experience sounded like it was surreal. But the one main tormentor never agreed. They thought he had killed himself. They find him later, but he would never, ever agree to meet Louis, to, be thankful that Louis wanted to, forgive him. He was probably a psychopath to the end. He finally did die, but he was rich when he died, and never apologized, or that part was sad. However, Louis became an inspirational speaker for the Olympics that were held in Japan in 1998. He was one of the torchbearers, and just his whole surprise and joy at meeting Japanese people, it was amazing. His whole story of resilience compared to that of the bird who was the tormentor. She plays off of that off and on, the good and the evil, and I just have to say that the good prevailed. He died in his 90s, enjoying life and everything about it to the very end. His nightmares stopped after the Billy Graham experience. Not all POWs are as lucky, and he recognized that, but he was thankful that for him it was. So, and they made a movie, Unbroken. It was not as good as the book, but it was good. So I would recommend this one, but it gave me like nightmares. So I'm glad I read it. I don't know if I'd recommend it for everyone, but it certainly gives you an idea of why it's, a lot of soldiers have PTSD. It's incredible what they have to endure. So.
Thank you, Bonnie.
Yeah.
And let's have Kelly share her books next that are set during times of war.
So you have Night Divided first, but I'm going to start with The Pull of the Stars. So we just read this in our historical fiction book club, and I try and talk about it whenever I can because it's an amazing book. It has all the things. It has war, it has a pandemic, it has sisterhood and solidarity. Like, it's a great book. It's written by Emma Donoghue, and she actually worked on this and almost finished it right before the pandemic. And then the pandemic hit, so she was in a real big hurry to get it out because there were so many parallels between the 1918 flu pandemic and what we're going on now with the coronavirus. But it's set in Dublin, in a Dublin hospital during 1918. What I loved about this book is that it was set in the maternity ward of the hospital. So, in the hospital with a flu pandemic, obviously you're going to have the flu patients and everything that's going on with that, but you don't think of the other wings of the hospital or the other parts of the hospital that patients are dealing with, or nurses and staff and doctors are dealing with. And we all know the pandemic, the flu pandemic, kind of overlapped during World War I. So there was the struggles of doctors being on the war front, but also needed in the hospitals. The main character, her name is Julia Powers. She's 30, I think. In her 30s, just turned 30. She's a maternity ward nurse, and she's in charge of the maternity flu ward. And it's literally a closet with 3 cots. And it's the struggles of her bringing to life these patients who have the flu and are giving birth. And it was really, really interesting. But I also loved how the author, she peppered in like the whole maternity ward thing, but then she also included the effects of the war during this pandemic. Her brother came home from the war shell-shocked and mute. He doesn't talk. They live together. And she talks about his struggles and as well as the relationships that he lost during the war that she didn't really understand until the end of the book, when she loses a relationship as well because of the flu pandemic. So the author kind of draws these parallels of the loss between war and this pandemic. My favorite part of the book is she introduces a character who was a real live person during the pandemic and the war, who wore fantastic hats for both. She was, her name's Kathleen Lynn, and she was a doctor during this time. She also, the author creates her as the only capable doctor in this hospital. Like, she's the only one who has common sense and who has like the, she's got the knowledge of what needs to be done to help these mothers in their pregnancy and labor and delivery. But she's also a member of the Sinn Féin, I'm probably butchering that, but it's a Democratic and Irish Republican socialist group. And so she is part of that, which is viewed as a rebellion group for a lot of Irish citizens. So she's released from jail. She's captured during war. She served as a doctor and as a leader of the suffrage movement and this political movement. She's released from jail so that she can, after the Easter Rising, so that she can combat the flu. So she comes to this hospital and she is, you know, helping Julia, and Julia thinks so highly of her. And at the end, she is arrested because of her beliefs in the rebellion and her political views. I went and researched Kathleen Lynn, and she is remarkable. If you have some free time, please do so. She became a doctor when she was 16. And she was one of the first women graduates. I forget what school it was, but I mean, she's amazing. And then she started getting involved in the suffrage movement, which led then to her political views. And I think she became the president of Sinn Féin in 1917, right before she was captured. So, I mean, I love that she brought in a real life figure. I love when historical fiction does that. And then, you know, she played so well with the character. So, but I'm telling you, if you want a book that has historical fiction, has lots of great messages, like I said, sisterhood, solidarity. It was really interesting right now to draw the parallels between the pandemics from 1918 to now, especially in a whole nother country, because this took place in Ireland. The government's hand in the war and the pandemic and the things that were advertised just blew my mind. So it's a very, very good read. You're probably going to cry if you're really emotional. Like I am. I cried a lot, but it's totally worth it. The second book is a juvenile fiction book, and it's also one of my favorites. It's one of my favorites to book talk to kids who have a little, like, are starting to show a little bit of hunger for historical fiction, and that's A Night Divided by Jennifer Nielsen. And first of all, I want to say Jennifer Nielsen is a fantastic historical author. She does a lot of research. Her books are always mind-blowing with the amount of facts that she has and the realistic information she has in there. It blows my mind. So this book takes place in Germany. It takes place 1961. 8-year-old Goethe, with her family, she has 2 brothers, and then her mother and father. And her father is he is involved in the resistance group fighting for democratic rights in Germany. And their neighbor comes over and warns them that there's some changes that are going to be happening, and he should probably go to West Berlin to try and find an apartment and a better way of living for his family, because things are going to get tricky. So he takes his middle son, Dominic, and they go over to try and find an apartment and a better way of living for the family in West Berlin. And overnight, the Berlin Wall is erected, and Goethe, her mother, and her older brother Fritz are on the east side, and her father and brother on the west side. And it stays like that because they have everything guarded and you can't do anything. And 4 years later, 12-year-old Goethe still has her eyes on the wall, and she's still looking for her father and for signs of hope. And she knows the risk of looking at the wall. I mean, you couldn't even look at the wall. There was guards guarding it with guns like they were prisoners in their own city. But she did every day on her way to school and her way home from school, she would look at the wall. And one day she sees her father on the wall, or next to the wall on the other side, pantomiming a dance. And she's really confused, and her brother's like, I'm sure you're seeing things. That wasn't really Papa. And she's like, no, I'm telling you it was. And then all of a sudden she receives a mysterious drawing, and she puts 2 and 2 together and figures out that her dad wants her and her brother to tunnel underneath the Berlin Wall to try and escape the Stasi's. She figures it out. Her and her brother do it. Of course, there's lots of obstacles. I mean, we're talking recording devices in their apartment. They can't talk. They have to totally play a different dialogue. They have to write papers down to actually say what they're doing, and then eating the paper or burning the paper in order to get rid of the evidence. You have neighbors turning on other neighbors. I mean, World War II ended, but there's still a war in Germany. You know, like this is when they were dividing everything. And so it's a story of friendship, of family, of love, of determination. It's amazing, and it's nonstop. And if you have a kid who is kind of struggling or is a reluctant reader but loves history, this book is going to hook them and it's going to keep them going, especially with all the other novels that she's written during this time period. It's fantastic. It's fast moving, and there's never a boring thing. I will say the end seemed a little bit rushed. It didn't take away from the story, but it was just kind of like, whoa, that's a lot that happened right there, and it kind of wrapped it all up. But again, I'm not complaining because it was a great ending, and just the book blew my mind.
Excellent. Thank you, Kelly. Let's have Jessica share her books set during times of war.
Thank you. So let me preamble my titles by saying that I have always been a huge fan of the miniseries Band of Brothers since it came out 20 years ago. It doesn't seem like it's been that long. No. And I've always known that it was based on a book. But it wasn't until last year that I decided to commit to actually reading the book. So the book is the same name, Band of Brothers, by the historian Stephen Ambrose. It follows the journey of Easy Company of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 101st Airborne Division from the formation of the company in 1942 in Camp Toccoa, Georgia, all the way to the end of World War II in 1945. It starts out by detailing the intense physical training that these men endured to basically become the best of the best. And this was training that they each volunteered for. There was nobody, only the paratroopers, you had to volunteer to be like to that level. So everybody volunteered for this. Some of the training included, there was a mountain at the camp and they would run 3 miles up, 3 miles back on a regular basis. When that was completed, then they had to go into the separate training to actually become qualified Army paratroopers, which involved training of jumping out of airplanes. So after the training was complete in the United States, they eventually moved to England in 1943 for further training. And then it picks up and follows their combat story from Normandy on D-Day to in the fall of 44 to Holland in Operation Market Garden, eventually to Belgium and the Battle of the Bulge. And then it focuses then on their transition from being a combat unit to being more of an occupation force when they eventually end up in Germany and then Austria. I think it really highlights not just the challenges of the war in general and the challenges of facing these enemy troops, but also just different day-to-day struggles that they had with things like they had lots of changes in leadership positions. The company commander position changed for various reasons, even though, as I said, the company formed in 1942. Some of those men were, together the whole time. But of course, as time went on, as they went through combat, they had to accept and work with what were called replacement soldiers coming in to replace those who had been wounded, seriously wounded or killed in action. And they also faced a great deal of harsh weather conditions at some times, and especially in the winter months going into the Battle of the Bulge, the whole thing came up so quickly that they were sent out into the freezing cold Belgium winter with hardly any winter clothes at all, because this attack was such a surprise that the Army wasn't able to prepare them at that time. So Band of Brothers, so it originally was published in 1992. The copy that we have in the library system is the 25th anniversary edition, which is special because it includes a new foreword by Tom Hanks, who was heavily involved in the production of the Band of Brothers miniseries. So at the end of the book, there is a chapter devoted to what happened to all of these enlisted men and officers once the war was complete. What did they do with their lives afterwards? And which I find fascinating. And particularly to segue into my second title, one of the central characters, you could say, in the Band of Brothers book is Major Richard Winters. And he decided after the publication, and that's Richard Winters on the cover there, that's one of his World War II photographs. He decided to write his own war memoirs after the publication of Band of Brothers. He would get so much fan mail, he said, asking for more and more, I want to hear more. And so this was his attempt to answer all of those calls for more. He decided to write his memoirs. So this is great. It gave him an opportunity to discuss his upbringing in rural Pennsylvania and how that affected his life during the war, and how certain family members that he was able to model his leadership style after them. He does spend a great bit of time talking about his life during the war, and he is able to expand on a lot of the stories and give more detail to a lot of the stories that are mentioned in Ambrose's Band of Brothers. It also gives him an opportunity to share not just what his life was like after the war was over, but also what his life was like once Band of Brothers was published, and what changed, how big of the big changes in his life when then he learned that the rights to the book had been sold to Tom Hanks, and his eventual role in working with Tom Hanks on the production of the miniseries to make sure that, you know, everything was portrayed as accurately as possible. And then once that came out, and he talks more about, then again, he had another transition into which he found himself being a very sought after public speaker on the topic of leadership. So that, and then he goes, he ends it with talking about his leadership strategy, and he goes over the whole spiel that he would do in a public speaking section. So one of the things that I find fascinating about the creation of Band of Brothers, to go back to that, is Stephen Ambrose. He was a very famous historian when he wrote this. And as he interviewed each of these men, each of the surviving men from Easy Company for this, he encouraged them not just to interview with him and participate in his book and his project, but he encouraged all of these men to write down their stories, to write these into books, and to seek out getting these things published, so that, because he knew that in his book he only had so much room to write so much, and so he felt there were so many more stories. So he encouraged all of these men to write their own books, and fortunately many of the men took him up on that. And so if you are interested in this Band of Brothers, this group of, you know, guys that were together, the Monroe County Library System, we also have several other titles on this topic written by several of the enlisted men and officers that were involved. So if Band of Brothers is something that you're interested in, certainly I would recommend starting with Band of Brothers and then beyond Band of Brothers. But if you want to go beyond that, the Monroe County Library System has you covered.
Thank you, Jessica. That's fascinating. I've only ever seen the Tom Hanks miniseries, so I knew it was based on a book like you, but I had never picked it up. That is fascinating. I didn't realize so many of the men involved had also written their own stories down. Thank you. Let's have Kristen share her book set during time of war next.
So my first book is The Boy in the Striped Pajamas by John Boyne. And actually my book club just recently read this. So I just had a reread of it recently, and I feel like John Boyd does a really unique thing with this book that always sticks with me when I read it, and it always impacts me continually. But the story is told from a perspective of 9-year-old Bruno, who is super confused and disappointed when his family has to move away from their house and their friends and everything that's kind of normal to him. And being that he's a 9-year-old, John Boyd sets up the storyline in the way that he isn't completely filled in on all of the details of what's happening. So he knows that his family has moved somewhere, and his father is working somewhere called Out With. And it's a place that's really isolated. There's lots of large fences. There's no other kids around. And so you gather throughout the book and Bruno's experiences that Bruno's father has become a commander, a Nazi commander, and that Out With is actually Auschwitz. I always say that wrong. Auschwitz. Auschwitz. I apologize. And you figure that out through the suggestive language in the book. But I feel like that's one of the unique things that really impacts me about this book is never once does Boyd explicitly say that this is about World War II and the Nazi concentration camps. You obviously get that idea, but I feel like the big takeaway for this book was to not limit it to one war, but to really encompass the emotions that happen within all wars, all situations of injustice and genocide and the atrocities of war that happen, and to take those general ideas and put them in the perspective of a 9-year-old, I thought was really, it's really heartbreaking. But Bruno begins to get bored because there's no other kids around. His sister is terribly mean. There's no other adults that are nice. And so he starts going out for these long walks, and he goes and walks along the fence, and he ends up meeting a young boy. Now he has no idea what's going on or why this boy is across the fence. So he ends up talking to this boy, and they become friends, and he meets with him every day during a certain time. And they end up forming this plan that changes Bruno's life and Bruno's family's life in a very tragic and warped irony, and it's terribly sad, but John Boyd has stated intentionally that this book is not supposed to be a nonfiction book. It's not supposed to be, I know it got a lot of flack from Holocaust researchers, and I feel a little defensive of the book because a lot of people said, like, this is not something that, number one, this is not something that kids should read, which I don't agree with. I feel like this is something that absolutely everybody needs to read in order to feel the emotional effects of what war can do for not only adults, and you see that towards the end of the book, and even in the middle, because you realize that Bruno's family is torn, right? Like his grandparents know what's happening and they know what his father is and they don't agree with it. And so he's not allowed to see them anymore. And his mother knows what's happening and she doesn't agree with it either, but because she is a woman and it's during that time and it's a dictatorship regime, she cannot do anything either. And so there's all these different conflicts that are happening in Bruno's life, and he's just trying to figure out a way to work through it. And he finds solace in this relationship with this kid who he never really understands what is happening until they end up forming this plan. And it's not until the end of the plan where I don't even think he really even realizes it then. He just realizes that, like, I have this friend and we're together. So I think that that's a really important book to read as far as books set in wartime. But if you go into the book thinking that it's going to be an accurate depiction with lots of facts about the Holocaust or World War II, I would suggest not going in with that mindset. It's a very emotional driven book. And I think the suggested age is, I think it was maybe middle school, early high school. So it's definitely like a YA book, but it's a really good book to start conversations. I know in my book club, we are all adults and we had really great conversations surrounded with this book. And it was also recently turned into a movie. They had some pretty big actors in it, and I liked the movie, but I feel like the book is just, you pick up on so many emotions that John Boyd has placed in there with the the little suggestive languages he has in order to build up kind of what's happening with Bruno. The next book is called Pink and Say by Patricia Palacco, who is a Michigan-based book, an author and illustrator. I love all of her stuff, and what I really appreciate about her is she's so great at storytelling, and this book is such a great example because this book is based off of a story that has been placed down through her family, and so it's a really heavy book. It is a children's book, and it is a book that while I was reading and going through and writing this out, you know, my daughter was asking me questions about it. So it really opens really good conversations that I think need to be have about like war and race and death and kind of America's history with all of those. So the story is based on true events, like I said, that have been told down through the family members of the author. So it was based on her great-grandfather's experience. And he is known as Say. He is fighting in the Civil War. He's just a very young kid, and he is wounded. He gets wounded in the leg. And Pink is an African-American Union former slave soldier. And Pink ends up finding Say, taking him to his house so that him and his mother can take care of him. So Say and Pink end up forming a relationship while he's healing. And then Momo Bay is Pink's mother. And so the three of them are just there and they're spending time together, but they're also laying low, obviously, because all of them, if they were found, would be in lots of trouble. So Pink wants to go back to the war. He realizes that being here is putting Momo Bay in danger because if anybody finds them, they're all done for. But Say is afraid to because he's a deserter. He left. So he doesn't want to go back because he knows that bad things will happen to him. And so Say has this internal kind of conflict because he wants to be brave like Pink, but he's really afraid to go back. He wants to protect Momo Bay, but he doesn't want to face what he needs to face. And then fate ends up kind of making that decision for him. So they go to leave, and then they're actually confronted by marauders with the Confederate Army, and Momo Bay essentially kind of sacrifices herself so that they can get away. But unfortunately, they are picked up by Confederate soldiers as they are trying to leave because they're young boys and they don't really know. They're walking around during the daytime. They're not really being secretive. So they get picked up and they take them to Andersonville, which if you've done any research about the Civil War, it was a horrible, horrible prisoners camp. It had like 3 times the amount of soldiers that it was built for. There was no clean water, no sanitation. And right when they arrive, they are separated. And there's this really emotional time where their hands are held. There is a story in the family that Say got to shake the hand of Abraham Lincoln. And so Pink will say to him, you know, I want to shake the hand of the hand that shook Abraham Lincoln's hand. And there's like, she does this great job of illustrating their hands together and they're ripped apart. And it's just a really emotional time in the book. And you don't exactly find out what happens to Pink, unfortunately, because no documentation happened. But it does say later on that they think that he was hanged and that he did not make it through the camp. But Pink ends up, or Say rather, Patricia's great-great-grandfather ends up living a long life. He gets sent back. So I haven't done much research past that point, but I'm assuming he got sent back because he was released. And I'm sure the color of their skin had a factor on that, especially during that time period. So he lived a long life, but it was a story that he continually passed down in order to keep Pink's memory alive. So it's a really, really emotional book. It's really beautifully illustrated, and I applaud the author for making it into a children's book because there is so many wonderful things about it, the friendship, the bravery, the camaraderie that they have. So I highly recommend that. Even if you do have children, I think it's a great book to read with them. I think it's good if you read that book and open that up for conversations, you know, even if you just start small. But yeah.
Thank you, Kristen. And my two titles, the first one, first of all, if you've been listening to this, you know that I typically tend to avoid war novels. They're hard to read. It's hard to look at the complicated versions of humanity and the people who have suffered through wars. So I tend to avoid them. I usually pick them up because we read them for book club. And The Secrets of Flight by Maggie Leffler is one of the titles that we read for our book club probably 4 or 5 years ago. And this one centers on Mary Browning, who is in her 80s, and she is the leader of a writers group. However, she herself has never actually written anything. She just listens to the other stories, she gives critiques, and into this writers group, and most of the women in the group are a little older. And into this group comes a 15-year-old named Elise. And Maggie's keeping her eye on Elise. She's not sure why she's come to this writers group, except that she's really excited about writing. And she just sees something there. And so she invites Elise to help her write her own story. And so Maggie and Elise sit down to write her story. And through that, it comes out that Mary, I'm sorry, I'm calling her Maggie, Mary, was a member of the Women's Air Force service pilots during World War II. And there's a lot that goes into her choice to even join. And then while she is a member of this, of course, women weren't allowed to fly in combat, but they did a lot of moving the planes around to where they needed to be. So she would be involved in that. And it was so fascinating. I didn't even realize, once again, that that was a part of history. I also was able to, after reading this, I happened to go to the Kalamazoo, there's an air flight museum in Kalamazoo, and they actually had, at the time, I don't know if it was permanent or not, but they had an exhibit about the Women's Air Force service pilots. And so I was able to see that. And here's me, and I don't know how old Tony was at the time, but I'm dragging him around going, and then they did things like this, and then they did things like this.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it was really neat, and the timing was just perfect. The book itself, I'll be honest, I usually really struggle with books that try and do 2 different time periods, where they do a contemporary and a historical, because I always feel like, just do the historical, like your contemporary issues are not as significant as what was happening back then. This one does it really well. There are a couple of wild coincidences, but I was okay with them. The thing that pulls this one in the contemporary storyline is the relationship between Mary and Elise. There's just something there that you're drawn to these characters and you care about them and you can see why they are important to each other. So that is The Secrets of Flight. It's a good book. It's worth picking up. And also a little easier to talk about than the book that I chose for my second book. The second book is Night by Ellie Viselle. And oops. Okay. Sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties. I think my screen is presenting. If it's not, that's okay. Night, it's an easy title by Ellie Viselle, who had an amazing life. And if you haven't read Night, you really, really need to. Even if you are like me and you try to avoid war novels and war memoirs, you need to read this. It is one of the most powerful books that has ever been translated into English. I feel it's a life-changing book because it lets you see 2 sides of humanity, the worst side of it and the side that lived through it, and turned it into something that makes the world better. So if you don't know Ellie Viselle, he and his family were taken from their home in 1944 to Auschwitz, and then later on he was transferred to Buchenwald. If my memory is correct, I'm pretty sure he's the only surviving member of his family. The book is only about 120 pages. It is powerful and moving, and what was said about him when he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1986, they called him a messenger to mankind, noting that through his struggle to come to terms with his own personal experience of total humiliation and of the utter contempt for humanity shown in Hitler's death camps, as well as his practical work in the cause of peace, Viselle has delivered a powerful message of peace, atonement, and human dignity to humanity. He's also received an honorary knighthood. He's written more than 40 books. You can probably watch him in lots of different places on YouTube in his various speeches. He's a man who speaks clearly from experience that says this has to stop. This cruelty, this inhumanity, it needs to stop. We need to find ways to find peace. The book is called Night. And I'm going to read one of the sentences from the book that explains why he chose that as the title. Never shall I forget that night, the first night in camp, which has turned my life into one long night, 7 times cursed and 7 times sealed. Never shall I forget those moments which murdered my God and my soul and turned my dreams to dust. Never shall I forget these things, even if I am condemned to live as long as God himself. Never. It is a powerful book. It is moving, and it is so important. Also from Ellie Viselle, he says that human suffering anywhere concerns men and women everywhere. And that is so hard to live because it's so easy to watch the news and go, well, I can't do anything about that. Well, I can't do anything about that. Can't do anything about that. Pardon me for a moment. So what am I going to do? Everybody can do something, whether that's just a moment of kindness to a stranger, whether that is doing more research about our history so that we learn not to repeat it, whatever that might be, we all can do something. And that is why these books are so important, I think. You know, all the books we talk about remind us of the struggle of being human and how do we do it better? How do we look back at these wars and make sure that something comes out of them that makes the world better instead of just continuing to repeat what we know we shouldn't be doing. So I think these are powerful books. These are powerful conversations. Thank you to all of you that have shared your titles. We will be back in a couple of weeks with sharing new books with you. And we hope that you have a thoughtful and a fun Memorial Day weekend. Thank you. Bye.